Welcome, everyone. As we move towards Resurrection Sunday, let us remember the words of the Apostle Paul found in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. That is where he says that without the resurrection of Jesus Christ, our faith would be in vain. That's how important the resurrection is. But before that event took place in history, there would be a difficult journey to travel. There would be the Last Supper, the garden, the arrest, the trial. In fact, there would be two trials, one before the religious leaders and one before the political leaders. And then there would be the crucifixion and the burial. Because of the horrors that took place on that Friday before Resurrection Sunday, one preacher proclaimed that Friday is here, but Sunday is coming. And thank God for the Sundays. Today, we are going to look at just one of the horrors that Jesus had to endure, which took place prior to the crucifixion and which led to the crucifixion. We are going to look at the trial of Jesus that took place before the religious leaders in Jerusalem. And so that we can have an understanding of what took place, let's read the verses found in Matthew chapter 26, verses 57 through 68, and then chapter 27, verses 1 and 2. First we read, "Those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. But Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and entered in and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death. They did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later on, 2 came forward, and they said, 'Well, this man stated, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days.' The high priest stood and said to him, 'Do you not answer? What is this that these men are testifying against you?' But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest then said to him, 'I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God.' And Jesus said to him, 'Well, you have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven.' Then the high priest tore his robes and said, 'He has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have now heard the blaspheming. What do you think?' And they answered him, and they said, 'He deserves death.' And they spat in his face and beat him with their fists, and others slapped him. And they said, 'Prophesy to us, you Christ, who is the one that struck you?' Now, reading from Matthew 27, verses 1 and 2, that night has ended. Jesus had been held, but now we read, 'And when the morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus so as to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor.'" As I have read these passages, I did so that we could get a sense of this part of what took place in what is called the trial of Jesus, which correctly could be called the mistrial. As I previously stated, Jesus had two trials. The first was a religious trial, which was before the religious leaders of his day who were allowed to try a man, and upon finding that man guilty, they could even issue a penalty, including the death penalty. But if they issued the death penalty, Rome did not allow them to carry it out. So if execution was a sentence handed down by the religious leaders, then that would automatically lead to a political trial. But as the gospel accounts show, the political trial was really nothing more than a rubber stamp of that which had already been determined by the religious council. So today, we are going to focus on the religious trial of Jesus. But before we do so, I want us to look at something that I feel is extremely important. The first thing I want us to know is that none of this caught Jesus by surprise. If you looked at John chapter 13, verse 1, it tells us now, before the feast of the Passover, well before the trial, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart and be out of the world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And we read in Luke chapter 9:22, where Jesus tells his disciples, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed and be raised on the third day." Jesus knew. And the second thing I want us to know is that Jesus accepted the Father's will. Look at Matthew chapter 26, verse 39. This says, "And he went a little beyond them." That means when he was in the garden praying, it says he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet, not as I will, but as you will." And then again in Matthew 26:42, Jesus prayed for the second time, and the second time he said, "My Father, if this cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done." Jesus knew what was going to take place, and Jesus accepted it. And while it may look as if Jesus and the Father are out of control, nothing could be further from the truth. Look at the words of Jesus when that band of thugs came to arrest him. That was right before what we read earlier. In Matthew 26, verses 53 and 54, Jesus says to them and says to his own disciples, "Do you not think that I cannot please to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? How then would the Scriptures be fulfilled, which says that it must happen this way?" And then 2 verses later we read Jesus saying, all of this has taken place to fulfill the Scriptures of the prophets. Jesus knew the Word because Jesus is the Word. Do you remember Peter's words on the day of Pentecost, some 50 days after the events of the trial? Peter, having received the promise of the Holy Spirit, he stands up in front of thousands of people in Jerusalem, and we read in Acts 2, verses 22 through 24, what he proclaimed. He said, "Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus, the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourself know, this man delivered over," now listen, "this man delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God. This man you nailed to the cross." We are going to read of godless men committing horrific sin, but know for sure that was all part of God's predetermined plan, a plan to redeem and save sinful man. So let's begin discussing the trial by me asking you a question. How can this trial possibly be fair? I mean, we just read in verse 59, "Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death." Do you see it? They want to put him to death. And because that was their goal, the highest and most honored religious leaders at that time were willing to knowingly use false witnesses to achieve their stated goal. And this was not a new thought. Sometime before this event, we read in Mark 11, verses 15 through 18. It says, "Then they," meaning Jesus and his disciples and some of his followers, "came to Jerusalem. And Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he would not permit anyone to carry merchandise through the temple. And he began to teach and say to them, 'Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a robber's den.'" And then we read, "The chief priests and the scribes heard this, and they began seeking how to destroy him. For they were afraid of him, for the whole crowd were astonished at his teaching." And by the way, that word destroy in the original language, it means to be put out of the way entirely, to abolish, to render that one who must be put to death. Jesus was upsetting the business of the high priest's family, and he was extremely popular because of his teaching and the miracles that he performed on behalf of the people. And for that reason, they wanted to put Jesus to death. That was their plan. And I say all of this so that when we look deeply at the trial, we can see that this was not an honest judicial trial under Jewish law. I mean, how could it be if they had already decided on the verdict before the trial even started? So let's consider what was taking place at the trial. In the Jewish trial of Jesus Christ, the council violated every one of their own laws. The Jewish system of jurisprudence and law and judgment was predicated primarily on one Old Testament verse found in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 18 through 20. Listen to what this verse says that they base their whole religious judicial system on. It says, "You shall appoint for yourself judges and officers in your own towns, which the Lord your God is giving you according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not distort justice. You shall not be partial, and you shall not take a bribe. For a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. Justice, and only justice, you shall pursue, that you may live and possess the land which the Lord your God is giving you. So there you have it. This is God's bottom line. Local judges judging the people with fairness and righteousness, never distorting what is true, not being partial, and never taking a bribe, and justice, and only justice. Now, as the Jewish nation worked out the practical application of what we just read in Deuteronomy, in regards to the local justice and how to judge righteously, they created councils which would later be called Sanhedrin. And the group of men called the Sanhedrin in our passage, they're in Jerusalem, and they were made up of 71 men, including the high priest. And to guarantee the practical application of fairness and justice as stated above in Deuteronomy, the Sanhedrin, and this is important, guaranteed several things. One, they guaranteed a public trial. In other words, there was to be no hidden secrets, no behind-the-scene trials. Everything was to be open and exposed so that no one could be framed or railroaded. Second, the Sanhedrin guaranteed that anyone brought in on a criminal procedure had the right of defense. That is, that there was to be a defender. There was to be someone who provided a defense for the person accused. And thirdly, no one could be convicted of anything unless there was 2 or 3 witnesses. So basically, those 3 things, a public trial, a right of defense, and a solid case based upon the evidence of more than one witness. And we in the Western world base our legal system on these 3 principles. But there was also a couple of other things that surrounded what the religious council would do whenever trying a person. And one of those things was that if there was going to be a witness against someone, and there had to be, that person better be telling the truth, because for that person it becomes a life and death matter. In Deuteronomy chapter 19, verses 18 and 19, this passage sums it up. If the witness is a false witness, and he has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him just as he had intended to do to his brother. Thus you shall purge evil from among you. Did you hear that? If you were a false witness in a life and death matter and it was discovered that you had lied, then you would receive the punishment that the one on trial would have received. So in this case, death. Oh, and one more matter about witnesses. It was very precise. The witnesses are to attest to the identity of the party. They had to be able to state that they saw or heard. They had to be able to state the month, the day, the hour, and the circumstances of the crime. In other words, it could not be hearsay or a generality. So what about the trial of Jesus? In the Jewish trial of Jesus, the high priest and the Sanhedrin violated every law of justice that we just spoke of. And they did so willingly. So now, let's go back to our passage in Matthew chapter 26, and let's go verse by verse and see how well they followed their own rules. And remember, these religious leaders took the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which includes Deuteronomy, as sacred. So we read that the soldiers take Jesus to Caiaphas' house during the night. But both of these acts are illegal, because the law of Israel said that no one is to be tried in any other place than the hall of judgment, and it is to be during the day. It is to be public. As we read, the Sanhedrin does not at this point even know what the charge is. They have no idea at the beginning of the trial what the charge is. So they're going to have to originate one. And we are told in another part of the gospel that before Jesus was taken before the high priest, he was actually taken before the high priest's father-in-law. And he was taken over there for one reason. He was taken over there because they were trying to figure out a charge before he had to go to Caiaphas. But they could not find one. And so he goes to this house, and we know it's at Caiaphas' house because it says that Peter sat out in the courtyard. So this is an act against their own rules. They're at night, and they're at a house, not the hall of judgment. And then we look back at 59. It says, now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus. False testimony so that they could put him to death. The Sanhedrin had a goal, but to achieve their goal, they needed witnesses. So they sought to manufacture or buy some witnesses, because the only way you can kill an innocent man is to have people to lie. But they ran into a problem. We read in verse 60, it says that they did not find any. I mean, really? You could not find 2 false witnesses that would agree with one another? The Gospel of Mark says it this way: for many bore false witnesses against him, but their witnesses agreed not together. Even their dishonesty was poorly carried out. Well, eventually we do read in verse 60 that they found a couple of witnesses whose stories sounded somewhat alike. In verse 61, these witnesses say that Jesus said, I'm able to destroy this temple of God. However, if one was to really read the accounts of their testimony, Matthew records one of the witnesses, Mark records the other witness, and if you put them side by side, the 2 testimonies had discrepancies. But even if the council accepted those testimony, if the council had allowed a defense, they would have heard, as stated in John chapter 2, that the temple Jesus spoke of was that of his own body. But even if the testimony of the 2 could stand up to the scrutiny, that which they testified was not a crime. It was nothing carried forward, and Caiaphas knew it. So that leads us to verse 62, where we read, now listen, we read that the high priest stands up and says to him, "Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" I mean, can you see it? Caiaphas rises from his chair and surely with great drama proclaims in a voice, "Do you not answer?" I mean, Caiaphas needed Jesus to say something that could be used against him, since thus far the council had nothing. But notice in verse 63, Jesus kept silent. Do you think anyone in the room might have thought of that great passage in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7, which says he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth, like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, he did not open his mouth. Certainly they should have thought of it. It was one of the best known messianic passages of Hebrew Scripture. He kept silent, so Caiaphas rises, and we read in verse 63, "I place you under oath by the living God. Tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." Now, please understand that when Caiaphas asked that question, he was asking Jesus if indeed he was deity. Caiaphas is not asking Jesus if he regards himself as one son among many, or as just one of God's creatures. No, he's asking Jesus if he is the Son, if he is deity. And look how Jesus answered. In verse 64, Jesus said to him, "You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Jesus says, "You said it. You said it. And I am." And then to drive his point home, Jesus quotes from Daniel chapter 7, verse 13 and 14, which is also a well-known messianic and beloved passage, and that was known to all of those who were attending that day. Jesus says, "Yes, I am the Messiah. Yes, I am the promised one. Yes, I am deity. And one day soon you shall see me exalted at the right hand of power." In other words, Caiaphas, no matter what happens this day, this is not the last time you will see me. And that was all Caiaphas needed. In the final verses, it says the high priest tore his robes and proclaims, "He has blasphemed." What further need do we have of witnesses? Well, they never had any witnesses. And then he cries out, "You heard it. You heard the blaspheming, right?" And they answered, "He deserves death." They were going to say that regardless of what was said. That's it. That's it. No need for false witnesses. No evidence needed. We have it from his own mouth. So Caiaphas cries out, "What do you think?" And they say, "Death." They've reached their goal. The only thing left was to show how sinful they really were. And now all they needed to do was the next morning reconvene and take him to the governor for one last trial and then the execution. One last thought. In this story, you have religious leaders who think that they know God, but the truth of the matter is that the one who is God in the flesh stands before them, and they spit on him and condemn him to die. And this one who they judged will one day judge them. God bless you.